On a crisp autumn morning in Boston's downtown courthouse, the familiar sounds of shuffling papers and whispered conversations filled courtroom 302. Judge Margaret Sullivan, known for her stern demeanor and sharp intelligence, sat behind her imposing oak bench, her silver-rimmed glasses perched carefully on her nose as she reviewed the day's cases. The courtroom, with its high ceilings and dark wooden panels, had witnessed countless stories over the years, but none quite like what was about to unfold. At 62, Judge Sullivan had handled thousands of cases, yet this day would forever change her life in ways she couldn't imagine. The morning docket included what appeared to be a straightforward adoption case. The Hendersons, James and Sarah, sat in the front row, their neat appearances and nervous smiles reflecting their hopes for finalizing the adoption of 7-year-old Tommy Matthews. Sarah Henderson kept smoothing her floral dress, while James repeatedly adjusted his blue tie, both trying to contain their excitement. Tommy sat between them, looking smaller than his 7 years in his carefully pressed khaki pants and white button-down shirt. His brown hair was neatly combed, and his big blue eyes darted curiously around the courtroom, taking in every detail. Unlike most children in court, he seemed unusually calm and focused. Mrs. Wilson, the social worker assigned to the case, sat nearby with a thick folder containing Tommy's file. She had worked with the Hendersons for the past year, monitoring Tommy's placement and ensuring the family was a good fit. Everything had gone smoothly, almost too smoothly, she sometimes thought. As Judge Sullivan began reviewing the case file, something caught her attention. She paused, her finger hovering over Tommy's birth certificate. The date and location triggered a distant memory, but she quickly pushed it aside. After 20 years on the bench, she had learned to maintain professional distance from her cases. Case number 2025 ADP 147, her clerk announced, in the matter of the adoption of Thomas James Matthews by James and Sarah Henderson. The proceedings began as they always did. Judge Sullivan asked the standard questions, her voice carrying the weight of authority that came with her position. Mr. and Mrs. Henderson, please rise. The couple stood, holding hands, their faces full of hope and anticipation. Sarah Henderson's eyes were already glistening with happy tears as she squeezed her husband's hand. You understand the responsibilities you're undertaking today? Judge Sullivan asked, her tone softening slightly as she observed their obvious devotion. Yes, Your Honor, they answered in unison. As Judge Sullivan continued with the formal questioning, she couldn't shake an unsettling feeling. Something about Tommy's face, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, seemed hauntingly familiar. She had seen those eyes before. But where? The morning light streamed through the tall courthouse windows, casting long shadows across the courtroom floor. The gentle hum of the heating system provided a quiet backdrop to the proceedings, and the occasional sound of a passing siren reminded everyone of the busy city beyond these walls. Tommy sat quietly, his small legs swinging slightly as they didn't quite reach the floor. He watched the judge intently, his head tilted slightly to one side, as if trying to solve a puzzle. Unlike most children his age, who typically showed signs of boredom or restlessness during such proceedings, Tommy remained remarkably engaged. Mrs. Wilson approached the bench when called, presenting her final report on the family's compatibility. The Hendersons have provided Tommy with a loving, stable home environment for the past year, she stated professionally. The commitment to his well-being is exemplary. Judge Sullivan nodded, reviewing the documents before her. Everything was in order. The home studies, background checks, financial statements, and character references. It should have been a routine case, one of dozens she handled each month. But as she prepared to move forward with the final declarations, something held her back. Maybe it was instinct, or perhaps fate's subtle intervention, but she found herself studying Tommy's face more carefully than usual. The boy met her gaze steadily, and for a brief moment, time seemed to stand still in courtroom 302. Neither the judge nor the small boy knew it yet, but they were moments away from a revelation that would shake the foundations of both their lives. The clock on the wall ticked steadily forward, marking the seconds before Tommy would speak those two simple words that would change everything. The morning sun continued to stream through the windows, unaware it was illuminating one of the most extraordinary moments in this courtroom's long history. As Judge Sullivan continued reviewing the adoption papers, an old photograph tucked away in her chambers seemed to call out to her. It was a picture she had looked at thousands of times, one of her daughter Rachel at 16, the last photo taken before she disappeared. The memory tugged at her consciousness, making it increasingly difficult to focus on the proceedings. The courtroom remained quiet except for the gentle shuffling of papers and the occasional cough from the gallery. Sarah Henderson noticed Tommy fidgeting slightly in his seat, his small hands clasped tightly in his lap. She gently placed her hand on his shoulder, offering silent comfort. Judge Sullivan found herself repeatedly glancing at Tommy's birth certificate. Born at Boston General Hospital on March 15, 2018. The date sparked something in her mind, but she couldn't quite place it. She had trained herself over the years to compartmentalize her emotions, to keep her personal life separate from her professional duties, but today that wall seemed to be crumbling. "Your Honor," Mrs. Wilson spoke up, "I have additional documentation regarding Tommy's early years in the foster system." She approached the bench with another manila folder, her heels clicking against the polished floor. As Judge Sullivan accepted the folder, her hands trembled slightly, something that hadn't happened in years. The new documents revealed that Tommy had entered the foster system shortly after his birth. His mother, listed as Jane Doe, had left him at the hospital with only a small note and a silver locket. The mention of a locket caused Judge Sullivan's heart to skip a beat. She remembered the matching lockets she had bought for herself and Rachel on her daughter's 16th birthday, just months before she disappeared. One half contained a small photo of them together, the other half empty, waiting for future memories that never came. James Henderson noticed the judge's unusual behavior. As an experienced high school teacher, he had developed a keen sense for reading people's emotions. He watched as Judge Sullivan removed her glasses, cleaned them with unnecessary thoroughness, and replaced them with slightly shaking hands. The morning light had shifted now, casting different shadows across the courtroom. Tommy's face caught the light in a way that made his features even more striking. His blue eyes, the shape of his nose, the slight dimple in his left cheek, they all seemed to echo something from Judge Sullivan's past. Mrs. Wilson continued presenting information about Tommy's journey through the foster system. "He's been remarkably resilient," she explained. "Despite moving between 3 foster homes before the Hendersons, he's maintained excellent grades and shown exceptional emotional stability." Judge Sullivan tried to focus on Mrs. Wilson's words, but her mind kept drifting to that spring day 25 years ago when Rachel had disappeared. The police investigation had turned up nothing. No leads, no clues, just a teenage girl vanishing into thin air, leaving behind a devastated mother who had never stopped searching. Tommy's file mentioned that he had been born to a young woman who arrived at the hospital alone, giving birth in the early hours of the morning. The woman had provided no identification and left before the proper paperwork could be completed. The only items she left behind were the silver locket and a note saying, "Please give him a better life than I can." The judge's hands grew clammy as she read through the details. The timing aligned perfectly. If Rachel had been pregnant when she ran away, she would have given birth around the same time Tommy was born. But surely, this was just her mind making connections where none existed, trying to fill the void that had haunted her for 25 years. Sarah Henderson watched as Tommy's eyes remained fixed on the judge. There had always been something old soul about him, a wisdom beyond his years that she couldn't quite explain. Now, seeing him study Judge Sullivan with such intensity, she felt a strange mixture of pride and unease. The courtroom clock ticked steadily forward, each second bringing them closer to the moment that would shatter the careful order of their lives. Judge Sullivan tried to maintain her professional composure, but decades of judicial experience couldn't prepare her for what was about to happen. Mrs. Wilson was just finishing her presentation when Tommy began to shift in his seat, his expression changing from passive observation to recognition. It was as if pieces of a puzzle were falling into place in his young mind, though no one else in the courtroom could see it yet. The stage was set for a revelation that would connect past and present, healing wounds that had festered for a quarter of a century. And it would all begin with 2 simple words from a 7-year-old boy who had unknowingly carried the key to a decades-old mystery. The air in courtroom 302 grew thick with tension as Judge Sullivan prepared to move forward with the final phase of the adoption proceedings. The morning had progressed normally until now, but something in the atmosphere had shifted, like the calm before a storm. Tommy Matthews had been watching the judge with increasing intensity, his young face showing signs of recognition that no one else noticed. Sarah Henderson felt him tense beneath her gentle hand, and James noticed his foster son's breathing had quickened slightly. Before we proceed with the final declarations, Judge Sullivan began, her voice carrying its usual authority despite her inner turmoil. I need to confirm a few more details about. She never finished that sentence. Tommy suddenly stood up, his small frame straight and determined. The unexpected movement caught everyone by surprise, causing a collective intake of breath throughout the courtroom. Mrs. Wilson started to rise from her seat, ready to intervene, but something in Tommy's demeanor made her pause. "Hi, Grandma," Tommy said clearly, his voice carrying across the hushed courtroom. The effect of those two simple words was immediate and devastating. Judge Sullivan's face drained of all color, her hands gripping the edge of her bench so tightly her knuckles turned white. The gavel she had been holding slipped from her grasp, hitting the wooden surface with a loud crack that echoed through the silent room. Sarah Henderson gasped softly, her hand flying to her mouth. James instinctively reached for his wife, while Mrs. Wilson sat frozen, her mouth slightly open in shock. The few spectators in the gallery leaned forward, sensing they were witnessing something extraordinary. Tommy remained standing, his blue eyes, Rachel's eyes, fixed steadily on the judge. "I found the picture in the locket," he continued, his voice small but clear. "It looks just like you, but younger." Judge Sullivan's hands trembled as she reached for her reading glasses, which had slipped down her nose. She tried to speak but found no words. For the first time in her 20 years on the bench, Margaret Sullivan was completely speechless. The court clerk, sensing the gravity of the moment, quietly signaled the bailiff to ensure no one entered the courtroom. The morning sun continued to stream through the windows, dust motes dancing in the rays of light as time seemed to stand still. "The locket." Judge Sullivan finally managed to whisper, her voice barely audible. May I see it?" Tommy reached beneath his collar and pulled out a familiar silver chain. The locket that hung from it was one Judge Sullivan had last seen 25 years ago, when she had given it to her 16-year-old daughter. She had kept its twin all these years, worn beneath her judicial robes every single day. With small, careful steps, Tommy approached the bench. The bailiff moved to stop him, but Judge Sullivan raised a shaking hand, signaling it was okay. The boy climbed the 3 steps to her position with determined dignity, holding out the locket for her to see. Sarah Henderson started to rise, protective instincts kicking in, but James gently held her back. They watched in amazement as their foster son stood before the judge, presenting the piece of jewelry that would connect past and present. With trembling fingers, Judge Sullivan opened the locket. There it was, the same photograph she carried in her own locket, a younger version of herself with Rachel, both smiling, their heads pressed together in a moment of joy captured forever on film. "Mom told me to keep it safe," Tommy said softly, his words striking like lightning in the quiet courtroom. "Before she went to heaven, she said it would help me find you someday." Tears began to roll down Judge Sullivan's cheeks, dropping onto her black robes. Mrs. Wilson was already pulling out her phone, presumably to contact her supervisors about this unprecedented situation. The Hendersons sat in stunned silence, watching as their carefully planned adoption took an unexpected turn. The court reporter's fingers hovered over her stenotype machine, uncertain whether to record this deeply personal moment. The clock on the wall continued its steady tick, marking each second of this extraordinary revelation. In that moment, the formal adoption proceedings were forgotten. The strict protocols of the courtroom dissolved in the face of a family reunion 25 years in the making. Judge Margaret Sullivan slowly stood from her bench, her judicial authority temporarily set aside as she faced the grandson she never knew she had. The story of a runaway daughter, a lost grandchild, and a silver locket was about to unfold, changing not just the lives of those present in courtroom 302, but the very definition of family itself. In the moments following Tommy's revelation, Judge Sullivan's chambers became a sanctuary from the stunned courtroom. The judge sat in her leather chair, her judicial robe draped over its back, as Mrs. Wilson and the Hendersons joined her. Tommy remained close to the judge, as if making up for lost time. "I need to understand everything," Judge Sullivan said, her voice steadier now but still thick with emotion. She held both lockets in her hands, her own and the one Tommy had carried. "Please, Mrs. Wilson, tell me what you know about Tommy's mother." Mrs. Wilson opened her thick case file, pulling out documents that would piece together the puzzle of the past 25 years. Rachel Sullivan, she began, using the real name they now knew, arrived at Boston General Hospital on March 15, 2018. She was alone and in labor. The words transported Judge Sullivan back to that terrible time when Rachel had disappeared. She had searched everywhere, hired private investigators, and never stopped hoping for answers. Now, those answers sat before her in the form of a 7-year-old boy with his mother's eyes. According to hospital records, Mrs. Wilson continued, Rachel stayed only long enough to ensure Tommy was healthy. She left behind detailed medical history, but no contact information. The only personal items she left were the locket and a sealed letter, meant to be given to Tommy when he was old enough to understand. Sarah Henderson reached into her purse and produced a worn envelope. Tommy showed us the letter 3 months ago, she explained softly. We were waiting for the right time to investigate its contents. Judge Sullivan accepted the envelope with trembling hands. Inside, she found her daughter's familiar handwriting, the sight of it causing fresh tears to well up in her eyes. My dearest Tommy, if you're reading this, you're old enough to understand why I had to make the hardest decision of my life. I was young and scared when I left home, too proud to ask for help, too ashamed to return. By the time I realized my mistakes, illness had already taken hold of me. The locket you wear contains a picture of your grandmother and me. She is a strong, loving woman who never gave up searching for me. Find her, Tommy. She will love you as fiercely as I do. Mom, if you're reading this too, I'm so sorry. I was wrong to leave. Please forgive me and love Tommy enough for both of us. All my love, Rachel. The room fell silent as Judge Sullivan finished reading. Tommy moved closer to her, his small hand finding hers. Mom told me stories about you, he said quietly. She said you were the bravest person she knew, and that you'd never stop loving her, no matter what. Mrs. Wilson cleared her throat gently. We were able to piece together more of Rachel's story, she continued. She settled in Philadelphia, where she worked as a teacher's assistant. She was diagnosed with an aggressive form of leukemia 5 years ago. Before she passed, she made arrangements for Tommy's care and left instructions about the locket. James Henderson spoke up, his voice gentle. Tommy came to us 2 years ago. We had no idea about his connection to you, Your Honor. He's been such a blessing to our family. Judge Sullivan looked at the Hendersons, seeing them now not as adoption applicants but as the people who had cared for her grandson when she couldn't. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you for giving him a home, for loving him. The morning light filtered through the chamber windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air. Time seemed to move differently now, as if the past and present were merging, healing old wounds and creating new possibilities. What happens now? Sarah Henderson asked, voicing the question everyone was thinking. Judge Sullivan straightened in her chair, years of judicial experience helping her focus through the emotion. First, I'll need to recuse myself from this case immediately. Then, she looked at Tommy, then at the Hendersons. Then we'll need to figure out how to be a family. All of us. Tommy smiled. A smile so like Rachel's it made Judge Sullivan's heart ache. Mom said you'd know what to do, he said simply. She said you always did. The past 25 years of searching, hoping, and grieving began to transform into something new. In Judge Sullivan's chambers, surrounded by evidence of a daughter's love and a grandson's patience, the future started to take shape. One that would bring healing to everyone touched by this extraordinary reunion. The days following the courtroom revelation brought a whirlwind of activity and emotion. Judge Sullivan took emergency leave from the bench, something she hadn't done in 20 years. The adoption case was transferred to Judge Roberts, while a deeper investigation into Rachel's life began to unfold. In a small coffee shop near the courthouse, Mrs. Wilson spread out the newly discovered documents about Rachel's life in Philadelphia. Judge Sullivan, the Hendersons, and Tommy sat around a large corner table, piecing together the story of the missing years. Rachel worked at Westbrook Elementary School, Mrs. Wilson explained, showing them a stack of employment records. Her colleagues described her as dedicated and loving, always putting others first. She never told anyone about her background, but she kept that locket close always. Tommy sat between his grandmother and Sarah Henderson, occasionally adding his own memories. Mom used to take me to the park after school, he shared, his voice soft with remembrance. She would tell me stories about when she was little, about the house with the blue shutters where she grew up. Judge Sullivan wiped away tears. We still have those blue shutters, she whispered. I never could bring myself to change them. The investigation revealed that Rachel had built a quiet, modest life in Philadelphia. She had earned her teaching assistant certification while working part-time at a local library. Her colleagues remembered her as someone who loved children but carried a sadness she never fully explained. Sarah Henderson pulled out a photo album she had brought. These are from Tommy's early years with Rachel, she said, sliding it across the table. The social workers found it among her belongings. Judge Sullivan's hands trembled as she opened the album. There was Rachel, older than when she'd last seen her but unmistakably her daughter, holding a toddler Tommy on a park swing. Another showed them decorating a tiny Christmas tree in what appeared to be a modest apartment. Each photo told the story of a mother's love, tinged with the regret of choices made too young. When Mom got sick, Tommy said, his voice steady despite the difficult subject, she started writing letters. Lots of letters. She said they were for when I was bigger, so I would understand everything. Mrs. Wilson nodded, producing a small box. These were in safekeeping with social services. They're arranged by date, meant to be given to Tommy at different ages. There are some for you too, Judge Sullivan. The judge accepted a letter marked with her name, but couldn't bring herself to open it yet. Instead, she focused on the medical records that documented Rachel's final battle. Her daughter had fought the disease with the same determination she'd shown throughout her life, never giving up until the very end. She made all the arrangements for Tommy herself, James Henderson explained. She researched foster families, made detailed plans for his education and care. Even in her final days, she was thinking of his future. The coffee shop bustled around them, ordinary life continuing, while this family pieced together their extraordinary story. A barista brought fresh drinks, sensing the gravity of the moment and quietly leaving them to their discussion. There's something else, Mrs. Wilson said, reaching into her briefcase. She pulled out a journal, its pages worn with use. Rachel kept this diary during her pregnancy and Tommy's early years. She wrote it for you, Judge Sullivan. She wanted you to know why she left and how much she regretted not coming home. The judge held the journal close, feeling the weight of unspoken words within its pages. She was just 16, she said softly. I wish she had known she could always come home, that nothing she could do would make me stop loving her. Tommy reached for his grandmother's hand. She knew, he said with the simple wisdom of children. That's why she made sure I would find you. Sarah Henderson watched the interaction with tears in her eyes. What had started as a straightforward adoption had become something far more complex and beautiful. We need to figure out how to move forward, she said gently. How to honor Rachel's wishes and give Tommy the family he deserves. Judge Sullivan looked at the Hendersons with gratitude and understanding. Rachel chose you for Tommy, she said. She trusted you to love and care for him. Now we have the chance to become something more than just an adoptive family or biological family. We can be Tommy's whole family, together. As the afternoon light began to fade, they sat in that coffee shop, surrounded by the pieces of Rachel's life, beginning to build a bridge between past and future, between loss and hope, between two families becoming one. The next few weeks brought significant changes for everyone involved. The Hendersons' home, a warm two-story colonial in the suburbs, became the center of carefully planned visits between Tommy and his newly discovered grandmother. Judge Sullivan would arrive each Saturday morning, her judicial demeanor softened by the role of grandmother. On this particular Saturday, the judge sat in the Hendersons' sunny kitchen, watching Tommy show her his science project, a detailed model of the solar system he created with James's help. Sarah moved around the kitchen preparing lunch, stealing glances at the pair with a mixture of joy and uncertainty. Neptune is my favorite, Tommy explained, pointing to the blue planet he'd painted carefully. Mon used to say it was like me, quiet but important. He paused, looking between Sarah and Judge Sullivan, trying to gauge their reactions to his mention of Rachel. The adults had learned to handle these moments delicately. Your mother was very wise, Judge Sullivan said softly, while Sarah nodded in agreement. They were learning to share Tommy's memories of Rachel, allowing him to love all parts of his family without guilt. James entered the kitchen carrying a box of old photographs. I found these in the attic, he said. I thought maybe we could all look through them together. It was his way of acknowledging that Tommy's history didn't begin with them, that there was room for all the pieces of his past. As they spread the photos across the kitchen table, Tommy's eyes lit up at a particular image. That's from my 5th birthday, he exclaimed. "Mom made me a rocket ship, Kate, because I wanted to be an astronaut." Judge Sullivan studied the photograph, drinking in the sight of her daughter's smile, so much like Tommy's. Rachel had managed to create beautiful moments for her son despite her circumstances, a fact that both broke and healed her mother's heart. Sarah watched the interaction while preparing sandwiches. These Saturday visits had become a delicate dance of emotions, of building trust and understanding. Sometimes she still felt twinges of fear. Would Tommy's connection to his biological family diminish his bond with them? But then she would see moments like this, where love seemed to multiply rather than divide. "Tommy," James said gently, "why don't you show your grandmother the treehouse we've been working on?" It was their special project, a symbol of their growing father-son relationship that James was willingly sharing with Judge Sullivan. As Tommy led his grandmother to the backyard, Sarah and James exchanged glances. They had been having long discussions after Tommy went to bed, working through their own feelings about this unexpected turn of events. "He needs all of us," Sarah had said one night. "And maybe we do too." The treehouse stood half-finished in the old oak tree, its wooden platform secure, but its walls still taking shape. Tommy climbed up confidently, then turned to help Judge Sullivan navigate the ladder. From below, Sarah and James watched grandmother and grandson settle into the treehouse, their heads close together as Tommy explained their building plans. "We're thinking of adding a telescope mount," Tommy called down to James. "Grandma says she'll help us pick out the right kind." The word grandma no longer caused tension. It had become natural, part of their expanded family vocabulary. The Hendersons had realized that Judge Sullivan wasn't trying to replace them, but rather to add another layer of love to Tommy's life. Later that afternoon, as they all sat around the kitchen table eating lunch, Mrs. Wilson stopped by with updates on the legal proceedings. The adoption would continue with Judge Roberts, but with modifications to include Judge Sullivan's grandparental rights. "It's unprecedented," Mrs. Wilson admitted, "but then again, so is this whole situation." Tommy looked around the table at all the adults in his life: his adoptive parents who had chosen him, his grandmother who had found him, and the social worker who had helped bring them all together. His face showed no confusion about the complexity of his family situation, only contentment. "Mom would be happy," he said suddenly, with that simple wisdom that often caught them off guard. "She always said family was about love, not just rules." Judge Sullivan reached for her grandson's hand while Sarah rested her head on James's shoulder. In this moment, they weren't an adoptive family and a biological grandmother trying to negotiate boundaries. They were simply Tommy's family, all of them together, building something new and beautiful from the pieces of the past. The afternoon sun streamed through the kitchen windows, casting a warm glow over this unusual gathering, this family that had found its way to each other through loss and love, choosing to build bridges rather than walls. In Judge Roberts' chambers, a unique hearing was taking place. Unlike the usual adoption proceedings, this one sought to create a legal framework for a situation without precedent. Judge Sullivan sat as a grandmother now, not a judge, her judicial robes replaced by a simple blue dress. "We're in uncharted territory here," Judge Roberts acknowledged, looking over the modified adoption papers. The Hendersons sat nearby, with Mrs. Wilson and their attorney present. Tommy waited outside with a court-appointed child advocate, drawing pictures of his expanding family. Sarah Henderson spoke up, her voice steady despite her nervousness. Judge Roberts nodded thoughtfully. "Mrs. Wilson, what's your professional assessment of this arrangement?" Mrs. Wilson opened her ever-present file. "In the past month, I've observed multiple interactions between all parties. The level of cooperation and mutual respect is remarkable. Tommy is thriving with this expanded support system." Outside in the courthouse hallway, Tommy sat with Ms. Parker, his child advocate, showing her his latest drawing. It depicted a large house with many windows, and in each window he had drawn a different family member: the Hendersons, Judge Sullivan, and even a smiling figure he labeled as Mom in Heaven. "Can you tell me about your drawing?" Miss Parker asked gently. "It's my whole family," Tommy explained. "Mom used to say love is like a house, you can always build more rooms." His simple wisdom often left the adults around him speechless. Back in the chambers, Judge Roberts reviewed the proposed arrangement. The Hendersons would maintain primary custody and all parental rights. Judge Sullivan would have legally protected grandparent visitation rights, including holidays, birthdays, and regular weekend visits. More importantly, she would be officially recognized as Tommy's biological grandmother, preserving his connection to Rachel's family. There's also the matter of Rachel's letters, Mrs. Wilson added. We need to establish a framework for handling them as Tommy grows older. Judge Sullivan spoke for the first time during the hearing. I want to respect Rachel's wishes. She arranged these letters carefully, timing them for specific moments in Tommy's life. The Hendersons should be part of that process. James Henderson reached over and squeezed Judge Sullivan's hand, a gesture that spoke volumes about how far they'd come. We're all Tommy's family now, he said simply. Judge Roberts observed this interaction with approval. We'll need to document everything clearly. This case could set a precedent for similar situations in the future. The legal discussion continued, covering everything from medical decisions to education planning. The adults worked together to create a structure that would support Tommy's unique family situation while maintaining clear boundaries and responsibilities. Miss Parker brought Tommy back into the chambers to get his input, a required part of the process given his age and circumstances. He walked in clutching his drawing, immediately moving to stand between Sarah Henderson and Judge Sullivan. Tommy, Judge Roberts said kindly, we're making some important decisions about your family. Do you understand what's happening? Tommy looked around at the adults who had become his support system. You're making it official, he said confidently. Like my drawing. Everyone gets their own space, or we're all in the same house. The adults exchanged moved glances. Tommy's simple metaphor had captured exactly what they were trying to achieve. Yes. Judge Roberts smiled. That's exactly what we're doing. How do you feel about that? Tommy's answer was immediate and clear. Happy. Mom would be happy too. She wrote about it in her letters. She wanted me to have a big family full of love. Judge Roberts made her final notes, then looked up at the assembled group. I believe we have the framework for something remarkable here. This isn't just about legal rights. It's about creating a model for how complex family situations can work when everyone puts the child's interests first. As they prepared to leave the chambers, Tommy handed his drawing to Judge Roberts. For your wall, he said, so other kids know families can be big and different and still perfect. Judge Roberts accepted the drawing with suitable gravity, understanding its significance. In this child's artwork, she saw the future of family law, flexible, inclusive, and centered on love rather than rigid definitions. The group left the chambers together, no longer separate parties but a united family, ready to embark on their unique journey together. They had created something new, a legal framework built on love, understanding, and the wisdom of a 7-year-old boy who saw family not as a fixed structure, but as an ever-expanding house of love. 1 year had passed since that fateful day in courtroom 302. The Henderson house, now expanded with a completed treehouse and a newly added sunroom, buzzed with activity as family and friends gathered to celebrate Tommy's 8th birthday. Judge Sullivan, now simply Grandma to everyone, stood in the kitchen helping Sarah arrange cupcakes on a tiered stand. Each cupcake was decorated with tiny planets and stars, honoring Tommy's continuing love of astronomy. The two women worked in comfortable harmony, their initial uncertainties long since replaced by genuine friendship. He's got Rachel's sweet tooth, Judge Sullivan remarked. The backyard had been transformed into a mini planetarium, with James and several of Tommy's school friends hanging glow-in-the-dark stars from the treehouse branches. Mrs. Wilson, who had remained close to the family, arrived carrying a special package. Another of Rachel's letters, this one marked for Tommy's 8th birthday. Tommy sat on the back porch steps, surrounded by his unique family. The letter rested in his lap as he carefully opened it, his face serious with anticipation. Judge Sullivan and the Hendersons gathered close, each ready to support him through whatever emotions the letter might bring. Dear Tommy, he read aloud, his voice clear and strong. Happy 8th birthday, my brave boy. By now, you've probably found Grandma, and I hope you've discovered that families can grow in unexpected and beautiful ways. Tears glistened in everyone's eyes as Tommy continued reading. Rachel's words spoke of love that transcended time and circumstance, of the family she had hoped her son would find. She wrote about the Hendersons, though she hadn't known their names then, trusting that the right people would come into Tommy's life. Your family, Rachel's letter concluded, is like the universe you love so much, always expanding, full of wonder, with room for infinite love. Be happy, my sweet boy, you are so loved. As Tommy folded the letter carefully, Sarah pulled in close while Judge Sullivan held his hand. James rested his hand on Tommy's shoulder, completing the circle of support. They had become exactly what Rachel had hoped for, a family bound not by conventional definitions but by love and choice. The birthday party continued into the evening. Tommy proudly showed his friends the telescope in the treehouse, a joint gift from his parents and grandmother. Judge Sullivan shared stories about Rachel's childhood, making everyone laugh with tales of her daughter's misadventures. The Hendersons added their own stories of Tommy's first year with them, creating a tapestry of memories that encompassed all parts of his life. Mrs. Wilson watched from a distance, professionally satisfied but personally moved by how well everything had worked out. The legal framework they had created was already helping other families navigate similar situations, with Tommy's case cited as a model of successful blended family dynamics. As darkness fell, James turned on the star projector they had set up in the backyard. Artificial constellations danced across the lawn while the children lay on blankets, pointing out their favorite patterns. Tommy lay between his parents, with his grandmother nearby, all of them gazing up at the same stars. "Mom would love this," Tommy said softly. "She always said the stars help us remember we're all connected." Sarah squeezed his hand while Judge Sullivan wiped away a tear. They had learned to embrace these moments when Rachel's memory surfaced, understanding that her presence in Tommy's heart made their family richer, not smaller. Later, after the party guests had left and Tommy was getting ready for bed, he placed Rachel's letter in a special box alongside the others. The box sat on a shelf between photographs of both his families. The Hendersons smiling at his adoption day, Rachel holding him as a baby, and a recent picture of all of them together at the courthouse after the final legal arrangements were completed. "Good night, Mom," he whispered to Rachel's picture. "Good night, Mom and Dad," he called to the Hendersons. "Good night, Grandma," he said to Judge Sullivan, who was staying over in the guest room that had become partly hers. As the house settled into nighttime quiet, the adults gathered in the living room, sharing quiet conversation and comfortable silence. They had created something remarkable, a family that defied convention but exceeded all expectations. Through loss and love, legal complexities and emotional truths, they had built exactly what Rachel had wished for her son, a home where love knew no boundaries and family meant everyone. Above the house, the real stars twinkled in the night sky, watching over this extraordinary family that had found its way to each other, proving that sometimes the most beautiful things grow from the most unexpected beginnings.